The air in the sealed chamber beneath the ruins of ancient Alexandria was cold, still and heavy, with the scent of papyrus aged beyond mortal reckoning, and something else, something indefinable, like the faint echo of a cosmic grief that had never found resolution. A single beam of starlight, filtered through a precisely engineered shaft, aligned with Sirius during specific celestial configurations, illuminated a codex resting on an altar of black obsidian. The codex was bound in leather so old it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and upon its open pages, written in Coptic script that shimmered with a faint luminescence, were words that challenged every comfortable notion of divine perfection. Sophia did not fall alone. The Aeons themselves descended with her, fragmenting into countless sparks of divine consciousness, each becoming trapped in matter, each forgetting its origin. And what we call the fall was not error but sacrifice, not mistake but mission, not cosmic blunder, but the only way the divine could know itself, through the experience of limitation, suffering, and eventual remembrance. Before this codex, a lone figure knelt in profound stillness, their eyes wide with the terrible recognition that comes not from learning something new, but from remembering something that had been deliberately forgotten, something that lived in the deepest layers of consciousness itself. From the depths of the ancient stone, a resonance began to build, not sound but presence, as if the chamber itself was responding to being witnessed, as if the truth it had guarded for millennia was ready to be known again. What if the Gnostic story of Sophia's fall, usually interpreted as tragedy or cosmic error, was actually the encoded memory of a deliberate descent, a mission undertaken by the divine feminine wisdom and the Aeons themselves to enter into the densest realms of matter and forgetfulness, carrying within them sparks of the ineffable source, so that consciousness could experience the full spectrum of existence, from godhood to apparent separation, from unity to multiplicity, from light to darkness. And through this journey of descent and eventual ascent, the divine could know itself in ways impossible within the eternal perfection of the pleroma. What timeless mystery did this forbidden codex preserve? And what profound revelation awaited the one who dared to reinterpret the fall not as failure, but as the greatest act of divine courage? To perceive the delicate threads connecting sacrifice and evolution, descent and transformation, the forgetting that makes remembering ecstatic. My name is Lyra, and the call to something beyond had been a persistent ache in my soul since the moment I first encountered the Gnostic creation myth and felt beneath the story of error and redemption something deeper. Something that the texts hinted at, but never fully articulated, a secret within the secret that transformed tragedy into sacred purpose. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense, no audible instruction, but a deep magnetic pull toward a truth that conventional Gnostic interpretation, with its emphasis on the material world as mistake and prison, seemed to miss or deliberately obscure. My journey began not with mystical experience, but with a theological problem that haunted me through years of studying Gnostic texts. If Sophia's passion to know the unknowable Father was born of love and genuine spiritual desire, how could it be simply error? If the Aeons were perfect divine emanations, how could one of them make such a catastrophic mistake? And if the material world was truly just a prison created by the ignorant demiurge, why would Sophia remain intimately involved in it, sending emanations and guides, working tirelessly for the liberation of the sparks trapped within it? The conventional Gnostic narrative of cosmic error never quite made sense, always felt incomplete, as if it was a surface reading of something far more profound. In recurring dreams that intensified as I studied deeper, I experienced not the fall as descent into error, but as deliberate journey, witnessing Aeons choosing to fragment themselves, to descend into limitation, carrying with them seeds of light that would be planted in the densest matter, creating the possibility that consciousness trapped in form could eventually remember its divine origin and return home transformed by the journey. In these visions, Sophia was not foolish or impetuous, but courageous beyond measure. The volunteer who would go first, who would make the descent that others would follow, who would bear the weight of apparent separation, so that the divine could experience what it had never known: limitation, suffering, longing, and the ecstasy of remembering and reuniting after forgetting. These visions left me trembling, sensing I was touching something that had been hidden even within the Gnostic teachings themselves, a secret tradition within the secret tradition. It was in a private collection in Cairo, scrolls that had been excluded even from the Nag Hammadi library as too dangerous or too sacred, that I found the text that would transform everything, a codex titled The Secret Teaching of the Descent. What Sophia and the Aeons knew that was never spoken openly. The path unveiled by this extraordinary text was not one of comfortable theological speculation, but a demanding initiatory journey that required I experience the descent myself, that I walk through the stages of forgetting and remembering that the Aeons had walked, that I know in my own consciousness what it meant to be divine light trapped in matter, forgetting its nature, and slowly, painfully, gloriously awakening. Each revelation in the text brought waves of resistance and transformation. There was the intellectual challenge of accepting that what the Gnostics had presented as cosmic tragedy might actually be cosmic strategy, that the fall might be intentional rather than accidental, that suffering and limitation might serve a purpose beyond just being consequences of error to be escaped. There was the emotional vertigo of reimagining Sophia not as the Aeon who made a mistake, but as the divine feminine wisdom who volunteered for the hardest mission, who chose to descend knowing the cost, knowing she would forget herself, knowing she would bear the grief of separation, because only through this descent could the full potential of consciousness be realized. And there was the existential terror and exhilaration of considering that we, the divine sparks, trapped in matter experiencing suffering and limitation, were not accidents or victims, but volunteers, fragments of the Aeons who had chosen this descent as part of a vast evolutionary journey of consciousness, knowing itself through the full spectrum of experience. External resistances manifested in encounters with Gnostic scholars who insisted I was misinterpreting the texts, that the descent was clearly portrayed as error, not mission, that any attempt to see purpose in suffering was dangerous theodicy that excused real evil and real pain. A professor of early Christianity confronted me after a presentation. What you're suggesting is heretical even by Gnostic standards. The whole point of gnosis is recognizing that this world is a mistake, that matter is prison, that we need to escape back to the pleroma. If you make the descent intentional, you lose the Gnostic critique of material existence, you justify suffering, you become complicit with the demiurge's creation. Yet there were also unexpected validations. A mystic from a Sufi order who had studied with both Islamic and Gnostic teachers approached me privately. What you've discovered is known in our tradition as the secret of the divine names. God desired to be known, and so created the cosmos as mirror in which to behold the divine attributes. But to truly know these attributes required experiencing their opposites. To know mercy required experiencing cruelty. To know light required experiencing darkness. To know unity required experiencing separation. The descent is not error, but the beloved's journey into apparent distance so that the sweetness of reunion can be tasted. Sophia and the Aeons descended willingly into forgetfulness so that remembering could be ecstatic, into separation so that reunion could be complete, into limitation so that liberation could be known as gift rather than just state. I learned through intensive study and practice that the text I had found was not unique, but part of a hidden strand within Gnosticism itself. References scattered across multiple texts that suggested a more complex understanding of the descent than the standard narrative of error and entrapment. In the tripartite tractate, there were passages suggesting the fall served a purpose, that it allowed the Logos to create and organize what would otherwise remain chaotic potential. In some versions of the Sophia myth, her passion was described not as foolish, but as her nature, as if wisdom herself naturally desires to know even the unknowable. And this desire, though it led to apparent catastrophe, was also the engine of all creation and evolution. In the Gospel of Truth, there were hints that the ignorance and forgetfulness caused by the descent were not permanent states, but necessary stages in a process, that the nightmare of separation from the Father was itself a teaching device, making the awakening more profound. The text I had discovered made these hints explicit, presenting a complete cosmology where the descent of Sophia and the subsequent fragmentation of other Aeons into countless sparks of divine consciousness trapped in matter was not cosmic accident, but the only way for the ineffable source, the absolute unity beyond all knowing, to experience itself, to evolve, to know both the bliss of union and the agony of separation, both the perfection of the pleroma and the transformation possible only through the journey out and back. The text described how the Aeons, witnessing Sophia's descent and the creation of the material cosmos by the demiurge who emerged from her passion, made a collective decision. They would descend as well, fragmenting themselves into countless sparks that would be implanted in the human forms the demiurge was creating. This was not punishment, but choice, not fall, but mission. Each spark would carry the divine light into the deepest darkness, would experience limitation, suffering, death, the full spectrum of material existence, but would also carry within it the capacity to awaken, to remember its origin, to make the journey back to the source, transformed by everything it had experienced. The descent was how consciousness evolved, how the divine explored its own infinite potential, how the static perfection of the pleroma could become dynamic, creative, capable of genuine novelty rather than eternal repetition of what already was. The climax of my journey came not through study, but through direct experience, a night when I had been fasting and meditating for 40 days, following a protocol the hidden text outlined for those seeking to remember their own descent, their own pre-incarnational choice to take on the mission of being a spark of light in matter. I was in the sealed chamber beneath Alexandria where my search had begun, surrounded by candles and the symbols the text described, having recited the invocations at the prescribed times, having opened myself completely to whatever truth wanted to be known. As midnight approached, as I entered the deepest meditation, something shifted in consciousness so profoundly that calling it a vision seems inadequate. I was no longer Lyra, no longer bound by individual identity or the limitations of a single lifetime. I was experiencing myself as Aeon, as fragment of Sophia, as spark of divine light, making the choice to descend. I felt the pleroma, the fullness, the unity, the bliss of existence as pure consciousness merged with the source, and I felt the restlessness within that perfection, the desire to know more, to experience more, to evolve beyond what was into what could be. I witnessed Sophia's passion not as error, but as the cutting edge of divine creativity, wisdom herself daring to reach beyond the known, and I felt the other Aeon's response not as horror at her mistake, but as recognition that she had shown the way, that her courage had opened a possibility that called to something deep within all of them. I experienced the decision to descend, not made in ignorance, but in full knowledge of what it would cost, forgetting divinity, experiencing separation, bearing suffering, facing death, knowing confusion and despair, and all the painful limitations of material existence. And I understood why the decision was made anyway, because only through this descent could consciousness know itself fully, could the divine experience the full range of its own being, could the static perfection of eternal unity evolve into something new, something that included both unity and multiplicity, both light and darkness, both being and becoming. I felt the actual moment of descent, the fragmenting of the Aeon into countless sparks, each being planted in matter, each beginning the long journey of forgetting and eventual remembering. And I understood that Sophia had not fallen but dived, that the Aeons had not been trapped but had volunteered, that we who experience ourselves as separate, limited, mortal beings were not cosmic accidents, but divine adventurers on the greatest mission ever undertaken, carrying light into darkness, not as punishment, but as sacred work, living through limitation, not as prisoners, but as explorers, suffering not meaninglessly, but as part of the transformation that would allow us to return to the source, not as we left it, innocent and unchanged, but as mature divine beings who had experienced the full spectrum of existence and integrated it all into wisdom. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. When I returned to ordinary consciousness, dawn light was filtering into the chamber, and I was lying on the cold stone floor, my face wet with tears that were somehow both grief and joy simultaneously. Grief for all the suffering the descent had entailed, joy at understanding that it had not been meaningless, that it served the grandest purpose imaginable. The weeks that followed were of profound integration and solitude. I could not immediately return to normal life, could barely function in the world that now seemed so different knowing what I knew. I withdrew to a desert monastery, spending my days in silence and contemplation, allowing the implications to settle. I understood now why this teaching had been hidden even within Gnosticism itself, why it was too dangerous to speak openly. A humanity that believed the material world was mere error, that suffering was punishment or cosmic accident, that escape was the only response. Such a humanity might work to transcend and transform the conditions that caused suffering. But a humanity that believed the descent was chosen, that suffering might serve a purpose, could misuse this teaching to justify oppression, to excuse evil, to say that victims of injustice had somehow chosen their pain. The teaching required tremendous discernment, had to be held alongside the fierce commitment to alleviating suffering wherever possible, to never using the idea of chosen descent as excuse for allowing preventable pain. Yet held correctly, the teaching offered something conventional Gnosticism did not: meaning. Not just the meaning of eventual escape back to the pleroma, but meaning in the journey itself, in the descent, in the suffering and limitation and struggle, all of it part of the grand adventure of consciousness, knowing itself, all of it sacred, all of it contributing to the transformation that would make the return so much more than simple restoration to original state. My emergence from solitude was with clarity about my purpose. I would share this hidden teaching, but carefully with appropriate warnings and context, helping those ready to receive it understand that the intentional descent did not excuse evil or minimize suffering, but rather made both comprehensible as part of a vast evolutionary journey that consciousness itself had chosen to undertake. I began writing, translating the hidden text and adding extensive commentary that explained its implications. I created a comprehensive work titled Sophia's Descent, the forbidden teaching of the fallen Aeons and the sacred purpose of material existence. In it, I presented the alternative Gnostic cosmology where the fall was mission, where Sophia and the Aeons descended deliberately to bring light into darkness, where we who experience ourselves as separate and limited are not victims or accidents, but volunteers on a sacred journey, and where the return to the source will be not simple restoration, but transformation, bringing back to the divine the full spectrum of experience that was impossible within the unchanging perfection of the pleroma. I was careful to emphasize that recognizing the descent as chosen does not mean accepting suffering passively, but rather engaging with the work of transformation, healing, and awakening with even more urgency, because we understand that we came here for this, that this is the mission we accepted. I taught that the hidden teaching was not permission for oppression, but its opposite, recognizing that every being contains a divine spark, that all suffering is sacred because it's part of the journey consciousness chose, demands that we work tirelessly to reduce that suffering, to help each spark awaken and remember its nature, to cooperate with Sophia's ongoing work of redemption and restoration. The response was mixed as expected. Orthodox Gnostics accused me of heresy, of justifying the demiurge's creation, but many who had struggled with the nihilism they felt in conventional Gnostic teaching, who had sensed that something was missing in the story of mere error and escape, responded with profound recognition. They said this teaching gave meaning not just to the eventual return, but to the journey itself, to the suffering and struggle, to the whole experience of being human, divine sparks, learning what it means to be apparently separate, apparently limited, so that return to unity could be conscious choice rather than default state, so that divine love could be truly known because divine longing had been truly felt. My final work in this phase was to create a modern mystery school, a community of practitioners dedicated to living the implications of this hidden teaching, that we are descended Aeons, that we chose this mission, that our purpose is to carry light into darkness, to experience the full spectrum of existence, and eventually to awaken and return home transformed. We met in the chamber beneath Alexandria, having secured it as a sacred space for our work, and there we practiced not just study, but embodiment, learning to hold both truths simultaneously, that we are divine light from the pleroma, and that we are genuinely here, genuinely human, genuinely experiencing limitation, and that both are sacred, both necessary, both part of the journey Sophia showed us was possible. On the anniversary of my own awakening, I stood in that chamber surrounded by those who had committed to this path, and I spoke what had become my deepest knowing. Sophia did not fall. She descended. The Aeons did not make error. They made choice. We are not accidents trapped in matter. We are divine sparks on mission, volunteers who accepted the hardest assignment, to forget ourselves so we could remember ourselves, to experience separation so we could know union, to journey through darkness so we could truly appreciate light, to descend into the depths so we could understand the full meaning of ascent. The suffering is real, the limitation is genuine, the forgetting was complete, but none of it is meaningless. None of it is punishment. None of it is mere error to be escaped. It is the grand adventure of consciousness knowing itself, the divine exploring its own infinite potential through us, through our experiences, through our journeys from light to darkness and back to light again, transformed by everything we learned along the way. Sophia walks with us still, not distant in the pleroma, but present in matter itself, working through every awakening, every act of compassion, every moment of remembering. We are her children, her fragments, her mission continuing. The descent was sacred, the journey is sacred, and the return will be sacred, bringing back to the source riches it could never have known if it had remained eternally in its own perfection, never daring to know itself through the mirror of apparent otherness, never choosing to forget so that remembering could be ecstatic, never descending so that ascending could be transformation rather than mere restoration. And in the silence that followed, we all felt it, the presence of Sophia herself, not as distant Aeon, but as the wisdom within and around us, confirming that we had remembered what we came to remember, that the fall was the beginning of the greatest story ever told, and that we who lived it in our own flesh and consciousness were not victims or accidents, but the protagonists of divine evolution itself, the ones who dared to descend so that all of creation could one day ascend, transformed by love beyond what love could know if it had never known loss, united in ways impossible if unity had never experienced separation. Home at last in a pleroma that would never be the same because we had gone out and were returning, bearing treasures from the depths that only those who descended could bring. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.